Welcome to the Southampton Education School Research Seminar Series. I am Achla Gupta. I'm a lecturer and program coordinator of our seminar series. Our events are open to all. We aim to facilitate meaningful conversations and contribute to advancement in the field of education. Thank you so much for your interest in this event. I hope you enjoy it. Please feel free to visit our website for details about our upcoming events.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming along on such a beautiful English. They tell me it's spring, but I'm not quite sure about that just yet. But I too, actually, in Australia, we generally, now I'm going to go for about 40 minutes. I'll pitch it at about 40 minutes. In Australia, we generally start with an acknowledgement of country, and most of our sessions. It was interesting. I lived and worked in Sheffield for about 4 years. And when I first got to Sheffield, I said to the guy who employed me on the EdPsych program up there, "Can you tell me who the traditional owners of the land are?" And he laughed at me and he said, "No, you don't need to, we're not concerned about that here." So let me just say that I do think of, whenever publicly presenting, I do think of the traditional owners of land that I live and generally work on. They are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We acknowledge in Australia that, well, a lot of us acknowledge in Australia that the Wurundjeri and Aboriginal land was never ceded. And so there is a saying that is said in Australia, which goes, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So I acknowledge their elders before and after now. And potentially any Indigenous people listening to this presentation today. Okay. Now, I'm calling this, that some here may know Roger Schlee's work in inclusive education. I'm calling this Roger's Reservation. Okay. So Roger speaks here to what inclusive education might be. And it's interesting because I think I like this quote because he picks out a couple of things with regards to what might be the essence of inclusion. And in particular, these fundamental settings that Roger speaks to here. Now, I'm going to come back to these quite regularly through the next 40 minutes, what these fundamental settings are. Because I do think inclusive education has prompted an interrogation of those fundamental settings, and it has done so particularly in interdisciplinary ways. You heard earlier that my background is as a psychologist, not necessarily as a school teacher. So I'll speak a little bit about how that has influenced the work that I do. I'm going to break the presentation into 4 sections. I first talk about orientation. I think this is an incredibly important aspect of understanding the work I do as an academic, and I hope that it sheds some light on maybe the approach you may take. But it's very much an anticipatory orientation rather than a retrospective one. Mm-hmm. Then go on to talk a little bit about finding and making and how educators work with the resources that they use. Ways of working, ways of moving towards your preferred ideals with regards to the work that you're engaged in. Now, there are 2 concepts that I've been working on in recent years, theoretical concepts that I hope are useful to some. I find them useful in my work. One is the notion of psychosocial justice, and the other is the idea of ecologics. I'll explain both of those as we progress through this session. But what we want to focus on, again, just to reiterate, is to challenge those fundamental settings. Now, primarily I'm talking from coming at this work as an educational psychologist, but you can apply this if you are aspiring to be an inclusive educator, if you are aspiring to be in any social science, I would suggest. So let's jump in. Okay. I wanted to talk about the resources that help us find our way to the kind of work that we want to do. Now, at times, I suppose that's why we keep on reading, and particularly as academics, we keep on reading because we may not be quite happy with the resources that we have available to us. And so I think of theory as a particular resource, a tool that we use to engage different forms of practice. Okay. Now, for me, John Schotter was a British social psychologist And his work has been fundamental to orienting me to the kind of work that I engage in. It was interesting. I mean, Shota, in my undergraduate degree, when I was qualifying as a psychologist, Shota was nowhere near the curriculum that was available to me in a very mainstream psychology program. How I came across Shota really quickly, one day I was at my university bookshop. I was in the bookshop because it had one of the best air conditioning systems in the university, and it was bloody hot outside. And so I was in the bookshop wandering around, and then literally on a shelf between sociology and psychology was this one book. And it was Shota's 1993 book called Conversational Realities. Now, I had started verging into reading into this area of social constructionism. Emphasis TION, not TIV. There's a big difference here psychologically between those two. Okay, but social constructionism, and so I picked up Shota's book. I took it home and I devoured it. And Shota's work is not easy to engage with, but I think it is bountiful with regards to the resources that it provides. Yeah, and as I say here, well, in preceding years, John Crombie, who's now retired, was, and now I think is emeritus at Leicester University. We edited this book in 2016, which brought together a number of world-renowned academics in the area of social constructionism to speak about the influence of Shota's work in the social sciences. Okay. Further to this idea of orientation, just a little bit about where I come from. Now, originally, that's a map of Australia you see in the top right-hand corner there. And that town that is, the city that is figured out there is a place called Townsville. It's about, I don't know, I'm not sure, what's the population of Southampton? How many? Right, okay. Townsville's just a little smaller than that. Probably about 250 these days. It is in what we would call North Queensland. I spent about half of my life there, and that's where I did my undergraduate work in psychology, where I started my PhD. Anyway, so I finished qualifying as a psychologist, and it was very important to me to go out and practice. I mean, at that point in time, actually, I wasn't thinking about a career in academia. I thought, my wife's a social worker. We were going to hang up a shingle. We had a great idea for a family-spun business, and a psychologist and a social worker, and out we'd go. But the reason it's about practice was incredibly important to orienting me to that private work that I wanted to get to. So straight out of my qualification, as was suggested in the introduction, I started working at the adult prison on the outskirts of town. That's on the lower left-hand side as you're looking at that screen. That was an interesting job. It was a challenging job. I'm old enough that when I qualified as a psychologist, these days, you very much have to pick the stream of work that you want to engage in. So these days, you train to be a clinical psychologist, or you train to be a health psychologist, or you train to be an educational psychologist. Back in those days, you came out with an undergraduate degree and could go into any profession you wanted. And so when the job came up at the prison, I thought, yeah, okay, I could do that. I got about 2 years in, and it was kind of like, I'm not really sure about this. I mean, this seems like a more punitive environment than I'd like to be associated with. And it really started getting me thinking about, what's the purpose of incarceration? What are its benefits? What are its negativities? And it was there that I started the idea of the PhD, which was, how do we talk about the people we intend to exclude? Anyway, then a job came up as the district psychologist for government schools in Townsville. And so I jumped at that. I originally wanted to be a high school teacher, so working back in schools really was a good fit. And so anyway, once I started working in the schools, 80 to 90% of my caseload were boys who principals wanted to exclude from schools. So consequently, I then included that population in a PhD, which oriented to both of those cohorts and talked about understanding how we describe people we want to exclude. Okay. So education, we think, is aspiration. Education should offer those who engage with it opportunities to forge into the future with an open horizon. One thing that concerns me, though, with regards to that orientation is and this is one of the fundamental points that I'd like to make for you today, is here is a quote from Richard Rorty, American philosopher, a pragmatist. This comes from his book of 1999 called The Philosophy of Social Hope. Nice book, nice couple of chapters on education in there if you're interested. But I really appreciate Rorty's succinctness here with regards to suggesting that there is no split between theory and practice. All theory is already practice. The question is the theory enacted? Because everyone who practices, everyone who works, we all operationalize theories. Whether we are cognizant of or explicitly aware of those theories, that is determined by our understanding of the work that we do. And so when I talk about orientation, one of the fundamentals to that orientation is, are we understanding of the theory that we employ in our practice? Because all theory is already practice. Another social constructionist theorist that I've appreciated over the years is another social psychologist by the name of Ken Gergen. Very accessible writer, Ken. I mean, he's written extensively over the last 40, 50 years. But I always like this quote from Ken. Now, you can take out psychologist and drop in any profession, I would suggest here, with regards to the idea that what are the resources that we're using to talk about the work we do, the people we engage, the practices that we impact upon? So think back to Rogers Reservation. What are those fundamental settings? What is it that we are doing in the work that we're engaged in? Are we telling it like it is? Or potentially, are we telling it like it might become? Is that not dependent on the resources that we employ in that theory practice continuum? And also fundamentally, I would suggest too, that it comes down to understanding the values that we bring to our work. Again, theory and practice, quite often when I talk about this with groups, people say to me, we get to the end, and then I still get the question, well, that's all well in theory, but. Now, to me, that just signals that the values that you're employing in the theory that you're enacting are maybe distant. They may, I mean, you are challenged in all the work you do, I do, with regards to the things that can work, that are encouraged to work, the things that are discouraged from working. But that doesn't suggest that we can't tell it like it might become. It doesn't suggest that we can't take the small steps that are built on the values that we want to work towards to get to where we would like to be. So, the second section of this discussion I wanted to present to you today was this idea of the difference between finding and making. If we understand the orientation that we're taking, we should be aware of the kind of knowledges that we're engaged in making. Well, and so that I probably tend towards the idea of making and not finding. Is it that we are finding things in the world that are undisturbed by our engagement with them, and we are simply moving along with those? To what extent do we have an opportunity to affect the things that we are making in the world? Henri Giraud, another great theorist to use. I mean, I hope everyone in this room's had some kind of contact with Giraud's work in the past. He's a prolific writer, but Giraud, as an educational theorist, reminds us that there is no separation between there's no conceptual purity between the resources that we use and the ways that we speak people into being. Mm-hmm. And I like Giroux's work particularly because he does really hammer into that all of our work is political and all our work is ethical. Yeah. Okay. Further on this idea of finding and making, I think back again to these fundamental settings that Roger spoke about at the beginning of this presentation. Now, are those resources, are those settings waiting to be found in the world? Mm-hmm. Or are we complicit in their presence amongst us? Yeah. Now, as you can see, the cartoon there speaks to ontological queries, as does the St. Pierre et al. Quote. I mean, it's academic language. I mean, engaging with the ideas of ontology and epistemology. But put more simply, I mean, when I'm generally writing, I usually just talk about ways of knowing / being. You know, that to me speaks to the inseparability of ontological and epistemological concern. You know, I don't believe that we can split those two apart. I think if we're oriented in a certain direction with regards to where we want to get to in relation to how we would like things to become, they are co-joined. Ontology and epistemology are not separated. Now, as a psychologist, as I said, I've been driven by trying to bring to bear a psychological theory that allows me to tell things like they might become. You know? And I struggle with that. I really do. Because, well, here's some examples. Let's shift slightly from the theoretical and look at some of the empirical. Yeah. Now, these 3 papers that are up on the screen, 2 of these are open access papers, so you could access them anytime. They're not behind a paywall. One isn't, but email me and we'll sort something out. So now this work comes from work that I'm currently engaged with Ben. Now we've been working in this area now for maybe 4 or 5 years, yeah. Maybe 6. It works in the area of what's known in Australia as inherent requirements. In England, it's understood as competency standards. In the US, it's understood as essential functions. Okay. Now, these are generally understandings with regards to that are applied to both professions and qualifications in university courses with regards to the competencies that qualified individuals should reach to be able to go into practice. Okay. Now, with regards to inherent requirements, there are a number of things that we need to keep in mind. I mean, as I said, they're probably referenced in 2 ways with regards to how they're applied. One is through universities use them as far as backstopping the academic integrity of their programs. Okay? So if you reach the competence standard within that course or unit or program of study, then you are said to sit above the standard that's required for that program. And so the academic integrity is ensured. Now, they're also used as minimum standards for practice professions. Now, quite often this is teaching, nursing, it could be medicine, occupational therapy, practice-based professions. And so there's a unique relationship here between universities and the qualifications that they're skilling people towards and the professions as they are practiced in the community. I often, before coming into a university to have a chat about inherent requirements, look on that university's website to see what I can find when I search for competency standards. I wonder if anyone can tell me what I found when I tried to search the term competency standards at the University of Southampton. Yeah, that's about what I found. Yeah. And I think that's one reason why. I mean, I got into the city last week, and I attended a meeting with Ben, who's starting to mobilise some work here with regards to the explication of competency standards within this university, and also making a connection to the University of Leeds as well. And some what sounds like some really interesting preliminary work with regards to exploring those topics at both sites. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But one thing that concerns Ben and I about the application of competency standards or inherent requirements is their potential to step towards ableism. I hope everyone here in the room would understand what that term means. But we're concerned that, now this is a really interesting discussion. Ben and I were having this on our way in here today. Can anyone be anything? That's a question. Could a person pick a variety of disability, pick a profession? Are they always going to work? No. And if you are committed to the idea of inclusion, at what point do you draw the line? These are really interesting questions to ask, because there are some in the community who would suggest, well, hold on a minute, everyone should be included. We'll work through everything, everyone should be included. There are others who would suggest everyone should be included, but we're not in a world where we can do everything for everyone. So everyone can't be included at this point in time, but we may be mobilizing towards that. There are other people who simply suggest, well, hold on a minute, we'll use those competency standards, those inherent requirements as they are deficitly oriented, and just exclude people. So where might you be situated with regards to the potential for ableism to be applied within that kind of work? Often it does, within university settings, allow educators to start thinking about reasonable adjustments, accommodations to working with people. I mean, that is a potential good about the application of competency standards. But again, because there's no agreed definition across the sector with regards to how that's to be applied, how is it going to be applied? So let me move on to the idea of psychosocial justice. I wonder if you would disagree or agree, or maybe be neither bothered by this question. Because if your orientation, if you're looking for ways to go on, ways that are motioned around inclusion, and if you accept and recognize that you have an ethical, political, moral impact on the work that you do, then what are those fundamental settings that you come across that you immediately feel that you need to challenge? My position on this is that is carried in this statement. I understand that relationalities precede our attempts to capture what it is that emerges from our investigations of the world around us. Okay? Let me say a little more about that. Now, you might have heard earlier, I didn't make millions of dollars out of being a rock and roll star. I'm not making millions of dollars out of being an academic either, but I certainly wasn't ever going to be a graphic artist. So here is my attempt at a recognition of this is psychology 101 for me, okay? So let me take you through that. At the top of the frame, we see the individual. That's quite often what psychology wants to focus on. The individual unit, that's kind of the center. That's the bullseye of research and understanding the world with regards to psychology, okay? Now, I've had difficulty with that ever since I was training as a psychologist. I think someone once said to me that I was more a social worker than a psychologist, but that's okay. I can live with that. But that individual, you would commonly know the kind of cognitive behavioral work that gets used to theorize that kind of way of being. Okay. Move to your right. The circle there encompassing the individual, let's just say that's the world or their context or their environment or something along that line, okay? So there's the person in the world. Now that is the constructivism that I warned you about a little earlier. The person in the world is somehow separate from that world. They exist in the world, but there is a separation between the individual and the world, okay? What I'm suggesting to you here with regards to relationalities is more the motionable coloured circle that you see down below there, that everything is in motion. My question to you is, where do you start when you start thinking about the people that you want to talk about into being? Where do you start? Where's the point of where you're going to, how you're going to go on? I mean, I'm not suggesting that you can't start in any one of these four spots. The last spot in the middle on the left-hand side is potentially, as we are trying to slow down the movement of life and talk about it, that it is populated by a myriad of material, non-material, human, non-human understandings that we are trying to come to terms with. Okay. So I'm not suggesting that we can't stop in any one of these places, but I think it is fundamental with regards to what we're about to say about the topic that we're engaging, where we do start. Okay. All right. The idea of psychosocial justice is one that I've been playing with for a while, because I get frustrated with the idea that when people talk about social justice, they're talking about this world that exists around us. They're talking about the structures and systems that are applied to people living in that world. Okay. But there's seemingly a structural, systemic kind of idea around social justice. And the flip side of that is the individuality of human rights. And so again, we've got this constructivist view of understanding that separates the person and the world. There is a space between that is, as much as we try to bring it together, it is still existent. So when we're looking at that 4-point diagram I just showed you, we're still engaged in a constructivist understanding of how to go on, how to challenge those fundamental settings, how to understand the essence of exclusion, how to go about whether we are finding that knowledge in the world or making it for the ways in which we prefer to tell it as it may become. So as we're moving towards a form of psychosocial justice, I think this needs to be balanced off. This is the commotion, this is the spinning coloured circle at the bottom of that graph. This is where we come out of relationalities to then understand how we want to talk about people. That has to balance off, because if it doesn't balance off, then we still remain in a separated world. We still remain in a world where we can exclude because of that separation. How might we address that prospect? Well, earlier last month, I think, this paper came to press in an edition. This was an invited paper in the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education. It was a paper that the guest editors wanted to work on around intersectional, interdisciplinary understandings of mental health promotion in schools. And so I've been playing with this idea of ecologics for a while. And so in this paper is also open access, so you can download that freely anytime if you would like to read it. I explain in this paper 5 conditions for ecologics. Now, I talk about them as prospective conditions because, recall, I'm talking about how we orient to the work that we do. So in the first condition of ecologics, it is about explicating our orientation. You know? It is about understanding how the prospects that we have before us might assist us if we want to be inclusive with regards to practicing education. How do we understand those settings that are before us? Yeah. And as Shota says here, those conditions, they aren't simply, someone might say that, well, are you saying that all you have to do is think good wishes and the world will be fantastic? No, that's not the case, because that, going back to Rorty, is wordplay. If there is no split between theory and practice, it has to be enacted in our embodied ways of relating to the world. That's the connection between theory and practice. It is the enactment of those conditions, the principles that we want to bring to bear in the work that we do. Explicating orientation. The second condition of ecologics that I'm interested in is, again, affirming relationality. Now, I think you probably, well, hopefully, understand that that is the position where I'm coming from, is that I feel that relationality should precede our engagement with ways of knowing being. If our orientations are anticipatory, then our ways of affirming that relationality will be recognized in the invitations that the world presents to us. If you're presented with something that is ableist, how do you respond to that? If you're presented with something that is racist, how might you respond to that? I think about relationality. I'll give you a really quick alternative understanding of relationality. I would think that most people in the room here would be aware of Bronfenbrenner's model of ecological systems. Yeah, okay. What's at the center of Bronfenbrenner's model? It's the individual. Yeah, okay. So it's the idea of the term that student-centered work is so prevalent in educational literature. But is that not this kind of constructivist model that situates the individual, the top of the four bases, as the primary place from which to begin? Yeah. I have trouble with that. I would prefer to see a more fluid and dynamic way of engaging with relationship, rather as a place to step off, as a place to proceed from, rather than starting from the individual. I mean, with regards to Karen Barrad's work, I mean, I'm not sure how many people here might be aware of Barrad's work, but a fantastic book that was written in 2007, which was titled Meeting the Universe Halfway. Now, Barrad took up the challenge of trying to bring quantum physics to social sciences. And it's a great book. If you haven't had the opportunity to read it, Barrad's work is fantastic because it sets out a way of understanding how to go on, how to engage from a relational engagement to other ways of knowing the world. Okay. The third condition of ecologic that is of importance to me is this idea of being comfortable with not knowing. Now, when I was practicing as a psychologist, it could have been quite easy for me to engage people on the premise of how they were being referred. This kid is bad. This kid misbehaves. This adult is a child sex offender. I mean, there are a number of ways that I could have engaged simply on the point of referral. But one area of theory that I found really useful when I was practicing was a theory that has kind of come out of Australia, New Zealand, now is kind of present across the world, an idea of practice called narrative therapy, which I found really empowering with regards to ways of understanding problems in people's lives that doesn't situate the problem in the person, that situates the problem as an agent in the person's life. But again, with regards to not knowing, what's the potential for change if we've already made up our minds about people's ways of being? Come back to the inherent requirements discussion. There will be people who suggest a person with a disability can't be engaged in a particular profession because we know that, an example, we know that, well, how does a person with a vision impairment surveil a schoolyard? Well, I mean, when I use the word we know that is simply through the practices that we've engaged to this point in time. That doesn't suggest practices that can be reoriented to be more inclusive. So accepting not knowing doesn't suggest that we can't make decisions. It simply suggests that we have to suspend our engagement with knowing being to the point where we can find ways to go on. The fourth principle, prospect for ecologics, again, very tied much into this idea of not knowing. Respecting unfinalizability. This is a great quote that comes from European philosopher Isabella Stenger's work. And as a psychologist, as educators, we're regularly invited to finalize things. I mean, I would ask you, what is assessment about? Is that a finalized idealization of competence? But here again, I really do appreciate Stenger's use of the word capture in this quote. Is that what we're doing? Are we allowing our not knowing to engage with others in the relationships that we're building, or are we trying to capture and put people into categories and finalize things as a way of going on? Ultimately, I wondered, isn't learning an unfinalizable prospect? Now, the last condition of ecologics that I want to talk about is working transparadigmatically. That's a big word. Now, it's simply about, what I mean by this, again, is simply that, how do we bring different ways of knowing being to a conversation? I'll give you an example. 2 years ago, some Australian researchers looked at Indigenous languages in Australia. In Australia, we have over 250 Indigenous languages. The thing that they particularly wanted to look at was whether there was a term that could equate to disability in any of those 250 languages, and there was not. Interesting, kind of related to that point, just recently, I've been reading Batja Mesquida's book. She's a Dutch cultural psychologist, and she's written a book called Between Us, which is a really interesting take on that emotions live in the world. They are agents in the world. We can look at emotions as things that people experience, but the primary way of understanding emotion is to understand it as an agent that exists in our world, much like that narrative therapy orientation that I spoke about earlier. And she's gone about, a great book, it's just come out in paperback. She's talking about the cultures around the world that engage in our orientation to emotion rather than my orientation to emotion, and what differences might play out there with regards to understanding that particular topic, emotion. So I think there's something about working transparadigmatically, particularly as it relates to understanding other cultural knowledges, which could be incredibly important for the work that we do as educators, particularly as inclusive educators. I mean, Indigenous communities born on cultures of kinship and care and collective responsibility. Those kind of our orientations are quite different from the my orientations, which begin with the individual and usually end with the individual. All right. So just to sum up, I spoke a little bit at the beginning about orientation and the ways in which we capture or recognize life. So fundamentally thinking about how we orient to the work that we want to do. How are we anticipating our engagement with that world? I then went on to talk about psychosocial justice. This very much speaks to those fundamental settings that Roger mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. Now, those fundamental settings have to belong, I believe, as entwined in the commotion of life that we're engaged in. If we proceed from a point of the individual or even the person in the world, we're going to get to a very different place than one where we might start with the relationality from which we then understand the person in the world and the individual. And finally, I spoke about ecologics. And again, I think they talk to the essence of exclusion that Roger mentioned at the beginning of this discussion. Because the essence of exclusion is the availability for separation. I'm hoping that those 5 conditions with regards to ecologics provide people with the means to understanding a practice which is more inclusive and a practice which gets them to where they want to be, to telling it like it could become. It's about where should we proceed from. Okay, so finally, I return to Roger here, where he suggests that there's no general theory of inclusive education. And I'd say that's great, Roger. That's fantastic. There shouldn't be a general theory of inclusive education, because then how would inclusive education ever be able to change? What's the prospect for change if we come to inclusive education thinking along that lines, or educational theory, or psychological theory? I mean, as we continue to gather in this assembly hall where knowledges are constructed, are made, potentially not found, it's our challenge to take up those fundamental settings, to potentially promote the idea of psychosocial justice in working towards more inclusive communities. Okay, I think I've taken up enough of your time. Thanks.